Amazon Post reporter Josh Rogin was on with Glenn Beck, of all people,
Really?
and talking about China's dominance of the South China Sea. We talked last week about the military maneuvers they're doing around Taiwan that's ratcheting up tension. And Rogan made some claims about Chinese military dominance vis-a-vis America that I think should be relatively concerning if they're accurate. We're going to find out if they are, but here's what Josh Rogan had to say.
China has tested a new hypersonic missile that can defeat our aircraft carriers and our missile defense. In other words, we spent 30 years building aircraft carriers and missile defense, and the Chinese built a missile for a 100,000th of the price that makes those things obsolete. That seems kind of important for people to know. Why were we hiding that? That was in the documents. I brought that out. I think there's a lot of stuff in the documents that American people should know because it reveals that the world is changing fast and our government really isn't on top of it, and they need to be. Right. It's hypersonic, which means it flies faster than sound, but it's also a hypersonic glide, which means you can maneuver it. So when we shoot up the missile defense, all we have to do is maneuver around it. And we can also they can also maneuver it to hit our aircraft carriers, basically as far as Guam. Half the Pacific is now, no entry for our aircraft carriers if they decide to use these things. That's a huge problem for Taiwan, but not just for Taiwan, for the entire South China Sea. They're basically taking over Asia while we're sleeping, okay? And now I'm not saying that we should buy hypersonic missiles to fight hypersonic missiles. I'm saying that we should buy the things or build the things that defend against hypersonic missiles.
For reaction to that, and of course the documents he's referring to are those leaked documents from that Massachusetts Air National Guardsman that we've been discussing for the last 10 days or so. For more on this, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, Vice President of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation and author of Brutal War, Jungle Fighting in Papua New Guinea, 1942. Jim, thanks for joining us.
So I want to circle back to your opening comment about the South China Seas, because it says something really important about this administration. So let's not forget to do that. But let's deal with Josh. He needs to take a pill.
Okay.
And deep breaths.
All right.
First of all, like most in what you find out when you get classified intelligence released is that how little there actually is in classified intelligence that you don't already know. So the hypersonic missile is a perfectly important. I mean, we've been talking about this for a decade. The 3 hypersonic missile is not new. You didn't need a classified report to tell you that. So I always go back to the thing that somehow that these leaks revealed special knowledge that the American people simply had to have. That's hardly ever rarely true. There's no malicious activity there. There's no illegal activity there. It's the classified intel. And honestly, anybody that follows the business, 97% of it, you would know already. Look, the nonsense about, oh my God, it's the super weapon and everything else is irrelevant. Well, remember battleships? Because the day after Pearl Harbor, battleships were irrelevant during World War II. Except we actually continued to use battleships throughout World War II. We used battleships through Vietnam. We actually recommissioned battleships and used them during the Cold War. So this whole nonsense about, I like Josh. He's a lovely young person. But honestly, his military assessment is pretty freaking superficial. Now, having said that, there is no question that the Chinese are building up their military capability in the Asia Pacific. And if we just let them do this for another decade, which Joe Biden would do, then there would come a day when the Pacific Ocean is China's lake. And that's what we're trying to alter. But, Josh Rogan's nonsense about aircraft carriers are irrelevant and everything else is, this is why they're journalists, right? Because if they were actually competent at something, they would have a real job like engineer or general or something.
Yeah, no, fair point. It's a good default position to always have, which I do. But with respect to China's dominance of the Pacific becoming China's lake, so what should we be doing to prevent that from happening that we're not?
The answer is, one is we should be building up our Navy. Two is we should be really building up our partnerships in the Asia Pacific, so we never face this situation like we did in Europe, where we're carrying the load and our allies are doing nothing. So, for example, the 180-degree flip that the Philippines has taken of challenging China in the South China Sea is awesome. We've actually got a pretty good lineup. No thanks to Joe Biden, but India, Australia, now the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. That's not a bad group of partners. And again, we hark back to things like the South China Sea and Taiwan, because those are part of what's called the first island chain, which is if you control these lands and waters, essentially you control all north-south traffic in Asia. And then essentially, if China controlled it all, it would be a wall where the United States essentially couldn't get to Asia. Why the South China Sea thing is really important is all of this started under a president we like to call Barack Obama, when there was this territorial dispute between the Philippines and the Chinese, and rather than stepping in, the U.S. just kind of blinked and did nothing, and the Chinese made their first big foray into the South China Seas that started them on this long march to strategic dominance. So what's interesting about that is many of the people, including people like Kurt Campbell, who are in the Biden administration, were in the Obama administration when they got their butt kicked by the Chinese over South China Seas. And this is why there's actually this war in the Biden administration between people who've been there before and said, are you guys frickin' crazy? I mean, we're liberals. We don't like defense. We get all that. But the Chinese are going to eat our lunch if we let them get away with us, and we need to be tough. And on the other side, you have John Kerry jetting over to China saying, oh, we have to work with the Chinese because, they're going to help us with global warming. So what you have in the Biden administration is one side arguing against the other side. And so the Biden administration says, well, we'll be tough, but not too tough. We'll stand up for ourselves, but not too tough. We'll push back on the Chinese, but not in a way to make them mad. It is the most feckless foreign policy that I've ever seen. It actually is exactly the foreign policy that got us into the Ukraine war, because we're going to wave our finger at the Russians, but we don't want to be tough with the Russians because we just want them to play nice. And then do you think the bad guys just sit there all day waiting for us to make up our mind? So that's the situation that we're faced with today. All this stuff is linked. War in Ukraine, runaway in Afghanistan, aggression against Taiwan, meltdown in Sudan. All of these have been administration which is literally as incompetent as you possibly could be, and not actually be removed from office.
Well, I wanted to ask you about Sudan because the State Department shared with everybody on Friday that one American had been killed. Did they wait too long to evacuate the U.S. Embassy there?
Absolutely. I tell you, those guys should have been out of there on day one. And as a matter of fact, they should have been out of there before. The way we got here is there were two, as you can know, there were two warring factions in Sudan. The Israelis were so desperate to bring Sudan into the Abraham Accords and expand the Abraham Accords that they really pressed on the U.S. to just kind of, let's just make a deal here. And the Trump administration kind of went along with that, although we didn't get a deal with Sudan. But the Biden guys came, and they just Blinken just ran over and signed an Abraham, celebrated an Abraham Accord thing with Sudan. But the problem is you had these two warring factions that could go to war with each other on literally a moment's notice. And the Wagner mercenaries, they're playing both sides against each other, and they're making a fortune out of this because they're raping the mines and everything else. And so this thing was on a knife edge. And anybody that followed Sudan could tell you that.
Well, I mean, you had 17 years of genocide in Darfur. I mean, this is not like
Right.
I mean, what?
That's not rocket science.
What's that? Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's like going to Disney World and saying, "Oh my God, there are riots here." So, this thing. So one is if you're going to be there, this is Benghazi too. If you're going to be there, acknowledge it's an incredibly dangerous place, and be really serious about being there and dealing with both sides and preventing conflict. But if you're not going to do that, have everybody have their bags packed and be ready to hit the because it's going to happen. So I do think we were still off the mark. Yeah. I think this is the third embassy we've abandoned now under Biden. So if you're an isolationist, this is going to be your favorite president.
So this administration that is, as you say, just generally incompetent when it comes to managing our geopolitical fortunes. Except with respect to Ukraine, what's your assessment of the competence there, particularly in light of the information that came out in those leaked documents that things are not going as rosy as they tell us they're going?
Well, again, intel. It's funny how people we can never trust the intel again after Iraq and the WMD thing. And then people get intel and they go, we got to trust the intel.
Well, I know. It's like the media. I get it. Like they lie, they lie. But, I believe what I just heard on CNN.
It's funny you should mention Ukraine, though, because actually today I have a piece in in Fox News where I talked about, well, if the president wants conservatives to support the effort in Ukraine, here's what he has to do. Because, look, I've never had a problem with supporting Ukraine. I think it's in America's interest to do that. Absolutely. And Ukraine can win, and if maybe not get every inch of its territory back, but be able to defend the country so the Russians can't run over. They can do that if they're properly supported. And I think a lot of the support is not necessarily with the Ukrainians wanting to fight for their country. It's with how we're supporting them. So we put out 4 points to say, these are the things that not every, because there's some conservatives that don't support Ukraine. I get that. But these are the things that you would have to do or should do if you actually want conservatives to support what's going on in Ukraine. Because, to be honest, what Biden has done since day one is he's used Ukraine as a blank check, and he has exploited Republican support for Ukraine by just saying, we got to support Ukraine. And so it's like, here's $1 for Ukraine and $57 for all the other stupid stuff I want. So we need a physically responsible plan. We actually need a plan, like what's our actual plan. Americans are right to demand accountability and of everything we spend, and we should expect the Europeans to step up, and we should focus on the military aid, the stuff that only we can do. The Europeans should carry the less. I mean, I think under those conditions, I think conservatives would say, yes, we have but we don't. We have this Joe Biden just being Joe Biden. And I think most of the problem I have with support is not with the Ukrainians. It's actually with this.
It's actually with what?
With the president.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to do enough not to get embarrassed like I did in Afghanistan, but I really don't want to do too much. What the heck is that?
So if we followed what you're proposing, what you outlined in that Fox op-ed, if we followed that, then what's the projection about how long are we in this theater and for how much, and what does victory look like?
Yeah. Well, often said people ask the wrong question, which is, when does this end? And my terrible answer is, I don't really care. My job's not to end the war. My job is to protect American interests. American interests are safe if Ukraine is an independent country, and if we could do that at a reasonable cost. And when people look at the numbers, first of all, in the end, it's going to be infinitely cheaper for us to be in Europe because of this war, because the Russian military is so degraded that the capabilities that NATO actually will need to defend itself in the future are demonstrably less. So I don't want to say we're going to break out ahead in this, but actually when you run the numbers, we're going to break out ahead. And the other thing is it's a big number until you look at everything else that this government is spending money on. If I just tallied up the fraud, waste, and abuse in all the $6 trillion just spending of Biden, it would dwarf Ukrainian war spending many, many times over. So I actually don't think the problem is giving aid to Ukraine per se. The problem is literally everything else this government is doing.
Okay, let me ask you a question. This is a general question. It's not specific to any theater. It's
I was only a colonel, so I can answer.
What's that?
Question.
I only asked general.
I was only a colonel, so I don't know if I can answer.
Yeah, right. So the latest revelation that Mike Morrell, that Tony Blinken was involved in tasking Mike Morrell to gather up all these operatives, ex-military, ex-CIA, ex-FBI, to do the Hunter Biden laptop disinformation campaign by characterizing it as a classic Russian disinformation campaign in advance of the 2020 election, as we all know. So, the circle continues to expand, and that, you harken back to Russian collusion and the Steele dossier. And then all the people that flacked for it for these many years, some continue to. When people talk about the deep state, number one, how do you react to that phrase? And number two, what do you think it means?
Well, I live with it every day. So for example, if you look at the number of union members in the U.S. government, which is massive, and all those unions are liberal. The reality is, the U.S. government not just riddled with people of one political party, but in government, particularly when there is a Democrat in charge, it is perfectly responsible to express your political views and act on them if you're liberal, and it's frowned on and punished if you're conservative, period. So if you're saying, are there people in government that treat government like a political instrument to support their party over the needs of the nation and their obligations as a government employee and their oath to the government? Absolutely there are. I mean, you'd be an idiot if you thought otherwise. I could have told you the day after that letter came out everything that's now apparently a revelation, because that's just how Washington works. Of course, some yahoo from the campaign called up their Pizzo and said, let me see one retired guys,
Right.
and have them write a letter that says this is Russian disinformation. The day the letter came out, there was absolutely no evidence cited at all to prove that this was Russian at all. None. The letter didn't cite any. Had any, and then so what was this was
Classic earmarks. That's how you say. Oh, we just said classic earmarks. We didn't say there was evidence. We just said classic earmarks based on our expertise. I mean, this is the two-step they do.
Statement that this is because it's not a classic. I mean, if you just looked at the provenance of the document and everything as how it was produced, it was not a classic Russian disinformation campaign. That's nonsense, and it's demonstrably nonsense. And career people that know statecraft would know that on the face. No reputable person would sign a letter that says this is obviously Russian tradecraft. No. Did they have one person who wasn't a political supporter of the candidate sign the letter? No. And
right, but the key,
they knew what that was.
Right, and so the key, though, for people's understanding is that you have people with very impressive titles that are willing to discard any cachet that goes with those titles in advance of their political interests, and that's what frightens people when you have generals and former acting CIA directors and FBI senior leadership willing to do that, willing to forego everything for electoral politics.
I have seen this all the time. It's either I'm a retired guy and I still want to have the spotlight on me, and I want to get invited to the cocktail parties and the dinners, and so I'll play ball. And they love to do that. The left loves to do that. I need a general. I need my guys, right? So, but they don't want them. The classic thing was General Jones. Remember, he was appointed Obama's national security advisor. He lasted about an hour and a half. And it was like, yes, they want my expertise as a retired general. I am so honored to serve my president. It's like, no, we don't.
No,
we
you're a useful idiot. Right.
You're like a potted plant.
Yeah, exactly. You're a mascot. Exactly. Well, I want from somebody inside the Pentagon like yourself to communicate that so people it really drives it home to people, which we appreciate as always. Jim Carafano, Heritage Foundation. Thanks as always, Jim.
Yeah, I'm now going to go take a tranquilizer pill.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today.
If your money is not earning at least 5.25% tax deferred, you need to call Professional Life and Casualty. They're offering a 5.25% APY on new funds deposited into your annuity, traditional IRA, or Roth IRA accounts. Rate subject to change. Please call